May 25, 1942. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in a dank basement beneath the Naval Administration Building where daylight never penetrated and the tropical heat was made worse by poor ventilation and the body heat of men working around the clock in conditions that would have violated peacetime labor regulations. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort stood surrounded by stacks of intercepted Japanese radio messages, most of them partially decoded fragments that meant nothing in isolation, but which his team of cryptanalysts and linguists had been piecing together for weeks into a pattern that suggested something enormous was coming. Rochefort had been running Station Hypo, the Navy's Pacific Fleet cryptanalysis unit, since before Pearl Harbor, had built a team of mathematicians and linguists and radio men who worked in shifts decoding Japanese naval communications encrypted with a system called JN25, a code book cipher that required identifying thousands of numerical groups and determining what Japanese words or phrases they represented. The work was mind-numbing, required obsessive attention to detail and pattern recognition that only certain types of minds could sustain for the hours required, demanded creativity and mathematical intuition because you were essentially solving puzzles where most of the pieces were missing and the picture you were assembling might not exist at all if your initial assumptions were wrong. For months, Rochefort's team had been tracking increased Japanese radio traffic, messages referring to an operation at a location designated by the code letters AF, references to dates and force compositions that suggested something far larger than the raids and skirmishes that had characterized Pacific naval operations since Pearl Harbor. The intelligence community was divided about what AF meant, where the Japanese were planning their next major offensive, whether this was a feint to draw American forces away from the real target. Washington analysts believed the Japanese were targeting the Aleutians, or possibly Australia, and they had resources and institutional authority that made their assessments difficult to challenge. But Rochefort, working with incomplete information and intuition, developed through months of studying Japanese operational patterns, believed AF was Midway Island, the tiny atoll northwest of Hawaii, that served as an advanced American base and whose capture would give Japan a position from which to threaten Hawaii itself. If he was right and American forces could be positioned to ambush the Japanese fleet, it could change the entire trajectory of the Pacific War that had been an unbroken series of Allied disasters since December 1941. If he was wrong, American carriers might be sent to defend the wrong location, while Japanese forces attacked somewhere else, with overwhelming superiority, potentially losing what remained of American carrier power and opening Hawaii to invasion. The decision about whether to believe Rochefort's analysis would determine whether thousands of sailors lived or died, whether battles were won or lost, whether the war in the Pacific could be contested, or whether Japan would consolidate gains that might take years to reverse. The story of how Codebreakers won battles before troops landed, how intelligence operations conducted in basements and mansions thousands of miles from combat zones determined the outcomes of military operations that killed tens of thousands and shaped the course of history, begins years before World War II, when the major powers understood that radio communications and mechanical encryption had created opportunities and vulnerabilities that would define modern warfare. Japan had adopted cipher machines and codebooks that they believed were unbreakable, because the mathematical combinations were so vast that solving them without knowing the keys seemed impossible. Germany had developed the Enigma machine, an electromechanical device with rotating wheels that created encryption so complex that German military leadership believed their communications were absolutely secure from enemy interception and decryption. The United States and Britain had built organizations dedicated to breaking these codes, recruiting mathematicians and linguists and people with minds that worked in ways that made pattern recognition and abstract reasoning second nature. These weren't soldiers in any traditional sense, weren't trained for combat or conditioned for the physical demands of warfare, but their work would prove as decisive as any battlefield victory, because knowing your enemy's plans before they executed them gave advantages that no amount of courage or firepower could overcome. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts had already broken some Japanese diplomatic codes, but had failed to break the Naval Operational Code, JN-25, to a degree that would have provided warning of the attack. The failure haunted American intelligence services and drove efforts to improve code-breaking capabilities so that surprise attacks could be prevented and American forces could anticipate Japanese moves rather than constantly reacting to them. By mid-1942, Rochefort's team at Station Hypo had made progress breaking JN-25 that allowed them to read perhaps 40% of intercepted messages. Not enough to understand everything, but sufficient to identify patterns and operational indicators that suggested major operations were being planned. The intercepts, referring to AF and the coming operation, represented potentially the most important intelligence windfall of the war, but only if Rochefort could convince his superiors that his interpretation was correct and that Midway was the target. To prove his theory, Rochefort needed confirmation that couldn't come from more code breaking, because the Japanese never used clear geographic names in their encrypted communications, always used code designators precisely to prevent enemies from determining their objectives. So he devised a plan that was simple but brilliant in its directness. He had Midway Island transmit an uncoded message stating that their freshwater distillation system had broken down and they were running low on fresh water. It was the kind of routine administrative message that would be transmitted openly because it wasn't militarily sensitive and because island garrisons needed to communicate with headquarters about logistics and maintenance. Within 2 days, Station Hypo intercepted Japanese naval communications, reporting that AF was short of fresh water. The confirmation was absolute, undeniable, and it meant that every reference to AF in the intercepted messages was referring to Midway Island, and that the massive operation being planned was aimed at capturing this tiny atoll and destroying American carrier forces that responded to defend it. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, had to make a decision based on intelligence that contradicted assessments from Washington and that required him to trust analysts who had been wrong about Pearl Harbor and whose track record was mixed at best. But Nimitz understood the value of intelligence and understood that Rochefort's team had been right more often than wrong, and he made the decision to position American carriers northeast of Midway, where they could ambush Japanese forces that would approach from the northwest, expecting to achieve surprise. The decision meant committing all available American carrier strength to a single engagement based on Codebreakers' analysis of partially decrypted radio messages, risking everything on the premise that men sitting in a basement in Hawaii had correctly interpreted Japanese intentions from fragments of communications and patterns of radio traffic. If the intelligence was wrong, if the Japanese attacked somewhere else, or if they detected American carriers and altered their plans, the result could be catastrophic defeat that would leave Hawaii vulnerable and extend the war for years. But if the intelligence was right, if American carriers could achieve surprise against Japanese forces that believed they were attacking an unprepared target, the results could shift the balance of naval power in the Pacific. On the morning of June 4, 1942, American dive bombers from the carrier's Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet found the Japanese carrier striking force refueling and rearming aircraft on their flight decks, vulnerable to attack in ways that would never have been possible if the Japanese had achieved the surprise they expected. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were burning wrecks that would sink within hours, taking with them aircraft and pilots that represented years of training and experience that Japan could never replace. By the end of the day, 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk against the loss of 1 American carrier, and Japanese naval aviation had suffered losses of aircraft and trained aircrew that would take years to rebuild, and that Japan's industrial capacity and training programs couldn't adequately replace given the accelerating pace of American naval expansion. The Battle of Midway changed everything about the Pacific War, ended Japanese offensive capability, and forced them into defensive operations that would be steadily ground down by American material superiority. And the decisive advantage that made Midway possible wasn't superior ships or aircraft or training. Though American forces proved competent and courageous when the battle was joined, but rather the intelligence provided by Codebreakers, who'd spent months breaking Japanese codes and weeks analyzing intercepted messages, and hours making the intuitive leaps that separated good intelligence analysts from mediocre ones. Joseph Rochefort's team in their basement at Pearl Harbor had won the battle before the first aircraft launched, had positioned American forces for victory through patient code breaking and brilliant analysis that gave Admiral Nimitz knowledge of Japanese intentions that Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the Japanese fleet, didn't know his enemy possessed. That intelligence advantage was worth more than additional carriers or better aircraft or superior training, because it meant American forces could choose when and where to engage on terms that favored them, rather than reacting to Japanese initiatives on terms Japan selected. Rochefort would later be shabbily treated by Washington bureaucrats who resented his independence, and his direct relationship with Nimitz would be transferred to a meaningless assignment overseeing a floating dry dock in San Francisco, while others took credit for his work. Would not receive the Distinguished Service Medal until 1986, decades after Midway and years after his death in 1976. But his contribution to winning the Pacific War was undeniable, and his example demonstrated that intelligence operations conducted far from battlefields could be as decisive as any combat operation, that wars could be won by people who never fired weapons or saw enemies except through the abstract patterns of decoded messages. While the Pacific War demonstrated the value of code breaking in naval operations, where advanced knowledge of enemy movements could position forces for ambush, the European theater showed how sustained code breaking operations over years could provide strategic intelligence that shaped campaigns and saved hundreds of thousands of lives through better operational planning and deception operations that multiplied the effectiveness of Allied forces. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in the English countryside 50 miles northwest of London, the British Government Code and Cipher School had assembled thousands of mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and clerical workers dedicated to breaking German military codes and ciphers that protected communications between Berlin and field commanders, between U-boats and their operational headquarters, between army units and their supply organizations. The primary target was Enigma, the electromechanical cipher machine that Germans believed provided unbreakable encryption, because the number of possible rotor positions and plugboard configurations created trillions of potential settings that would require years of computation to solve by brute force methods. The German confidence in Enigma's security was so complete that they used it for communications at every level, from strategic planning to tactical operations, sending messages over radio networks that British listening stations intercepted but couldn't read without breaking the encryption that protected them. The effort to break Enigma had begun before the war, when Polish mathematicians had developed methods for determining rotor positions that worked against early Enigma variants. And when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Polish cryptanalysts shared their methods with British and French intelligence services before their country was overrun. At Bletchley Park, mathematicians led by Alan Turing developed machines called bombies that automated the search for daily Enigma key settings, processing thousands of potential rotor combinations per hour, and identifying settings that produced intelligible German text from encrypted intercepts. The process required intercepting German messages, using patterns in message formats and stereotyped phrases that German operators used to reduce the search space, running bomb machines for hours until settings were found that unlocked that day's communications, and then translating and analyzing the decrypted messages to extract intelligence that could guide Allied operations. The intelligence produced through this process was codenamed Ultra, and was so sensitive that only the most senior Allied commanders could access it, and even they couldn't act on Ultra intelligence in ways that would reveal to Germans that their codes were being read, because if Germany realized Enigma was compromised, they would change their procedures and the intelligence source would be lost. By 1944, as Allied forces prepared for Operation Overlord, the invasion of German-occupied France that would open the Second Front and begin the liberation of Western Europe, ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park had been providing Allied commanders with insights into German defensive preparations, unit locations, supply situations, and strategic intentions for years. The Codebreakers had expanded beyond breaking. Enigma to attacking other German cipher systems, including the Lorenz teleprinter cipher, used for high-level strategic communications between Hitler and his army group commanders. Developing Colossus, one of the world's first programmable electronic computers, to break Lorenz messages that provided intelligence about German strategic thinking at the highest levels. The intelligence picture that emerged from this sustained code-breaking effort gave Allied planners advantages that fundamentally shaped how Overlord was conceived and executed. Knowing German force dispositions meant Allied planners could identify where German defenses were strongest and where they were relatively weaker, allowing them to select invasion beaches where successful landings were most likely. Knowing German expectations about where the invasion would come meant Allied deception planners could reinforce German beliefs that the main invasion would target the Pas de Calais rather than Normandy, leading to Operation Fortitude, an elaborate deception operation that convinced German High Command to hold powerful armored reserves away from Normandy beaches even after the invasion had begun because they believed Normandy was a feint and the real invasion was still coming at Calais. Ultra-intelligence revealed German concerns about their defensive preparations, showed that Hitler and his commanders disagreed about how to defend France and that Rommel's desire to stop the invasion at the beaches had been compromised by Hitler's insistence on holding reserves inland, where they couldn't immediately respond to landings. This intelligence allowed Allied commanders to understand that if they could break through coastal defenses and establish a beachhead quickly, German counterattacks would be delayed by strategic disagreements and by the need to move reserves significant distances before they could engage. On June 6, 1944, as 156,000 Allied troops stormed ashore on 5 Normandy beaches in the largest amphibious operation in history, the 7,000 workers at Bletchley Park were decrypting German communications in near real time, providing Allied commanders with intelligence about German responses to the invasion, often within hours of German commanders sending their reports and requests for reinforcements. The decrypts showed German confusion about whether Normandy was the main invasion or a diversion, revealed orders from Hitler forbidding retreat and demanding counterattacks that tactical commanders knew were impossible, tracked the movement of German armored reserves from southern France and from positions defending against the phantom Calais invasion that Operation Fortitude had convinced German High Command was still coming. Throughout the Normandy campaign and the subsequent advance across France and into Germany, ultra-intelligence gave Allied commanders advantages in understanding German capabilities and intentions that helped them avoid ambushes, exploit German weaknesses, and anticipate German counterattacks before they developed. The intelligence couldn't win battles by itself. Troops still had to fight and die taking defended positions, but it multiplied the effectiveness of Allied forces by allowing commanders to concentrate strength against weakness, to avoid German strength when possible, and to disrupt German operations by attacking supply lines and communications networks that ultra-intelligence had revealed. The extent to which ultra-intelligence contributed to Allied victory in Europe has been debated by historians, with estimates suggesting it shortened the war by anywhere from 6 months to 2 years and saved hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties by preventing failed operations and enabling more effective campaigns. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, said after the war that ultra-intelligence had been decisive, that it provided advantages worth dozens of divisions, that knowing German intentions and capabilities had been worth more than additional troops or equipment because it allowed existing forces to be used with maximum effectiveness. The code-breaking operations at Bletchley Park and Station Hypo were enabled by peculiar combinations of mathematical talent, linguistic skill, technical innovation, and institutional support that not all nations could mobilize or sustain. The British had a tradition of amateur scholarship and intellectual eccentricity that made recruiting mathematicians and puzzle enthusiasts into intelligence work seem natural, and the Government Code and Cipher School had been established after World War I when the value of signals intelligence had been demonstrated through British success reading German naval codes during the Battle of Jutland. Alan Turing was a Cambridge mathematician whose work on theoretical computation had no obvious military application, but whose mind worked in ways that made him extraordinarily effective at attacking problems that seemed impossible, at finding patterns in apparent randomness, at developing automated methods for solving problems that would take humans years to complete manually. The Americans had naval officers like Joseph Rochefort, who combined technical competence with aggressive instincts and who understood that intelligence was worthless unless commanders trusted it enough to act on it, who built relationships with operational commanders that ensured their intelligence products were taken seriously rather than dismissed as academic speculation. Both organizations recruited women in large numbers for clerical and analytical work because the war had created labor shortages and because intelligence work didn't require physical strength or combat training. And these women often proved more patient and detail-oriented than their male counterparts in the tedious work of processing intercepts and maintaining card indexes and operating bomb machines that ran for hours producing nonsense, until they found settings that unlocked encrypted messages. The work was secret, conducted under conditions where workers couldn't discuss what they did even with family members, where success couldn't be publicized, and failure could mean catastrophic defeats if intelligence led commanders into ambushes, or if operational decisions revealed to enemies that their codes were compromised. The psychological pressure was enormous because everyone working in these organizations understood that their analysis might determine whether operations succeeded or failed, whether thousands of soldiers lived or died, whether battles were won or lost. Mistakes could be fatal not just to the analysts, but to the troops whose safety depended on accurate intelligence. And the responsibility weighed heavily on people who were often young and inexperienced, and who had to make judgments based on incomplete information under time pressure that didn't allow for careful verification. The German failure to realize their codes were being systematically broken throughout the war stands as one of the great intelligence failures in military history and reflected organizational culture and technological overconfidence that prevented them from recognizing vulnerabilities that careful analysis should have revealed. German military leadership believed Enigma was mathematically unbreakable, and that belief made them dismissive of evidence that suggested British forces had intelligence about German operations that could only have come from reading encrypted communications. When British forces demonstrated knowledge of German U-boat positions, or when Allied bombers attacked German convoys that hadn't been reported by reconnaissance aircraft, German naval intelligence investigated whether spies were leaking information, or whether Allied radar capabilities were better than understood, but they consistently rejected the possibility that Enigma was compromised because breaking it seemed mathematically impossible and because acknowledging the compromise would mean years of communications had been read by enemies, which was too catastrophic to accept, without absolute proof. The rigidity of German military bureaucracy prevented lower-level officers who suspected code compromise from challenging assessments made by senior officials who'd staked their reputations on Enigma's security. The compartmentalization of German intelligence services meant that different organizations didn't share information that might have revealed patterns suggesting code compromise, and the general German tendency toward overconfidence in their technology made them slow to recognize that enemies had developed capabilities Germans assumed were beyond them. The British and Americans went to extraordinary lengths to protect Ultra, refusing to act on intelligence if doing so would reveal to Germans that their codes were being read, sacrificing ships and convoys when necessary to protect the secret that was worth more than any single tactical victory. They created cover stories to explain how intelligence had been obtained, claiming that reconnaissance aircraft or spies had spotted German forces that Ultra had actually revealed, building elaborate deception operations to give Germans plausible explanations for Allied knowledge that had actually come from code breaking. The discipline required to maintain this deception for years across thousands of personnel who knew the secret was remarkable and testified to understanding that preserving the intelligence source was more important than exploiting every piece of intelligence it provided. The pattern repeated in the Pacific, where Japanese naval leadership believed their codes were secure because they regularly changed codebooks and because the JN-25 cipher used by their fleet seemed too complex to break without access to the codebooks themselves. American cryptanalysts exploited patterns in how Japanese operators used the codes, statistical analysis of which numerical groups appeared most frequently, cribs where stereotyped phrases in message formats provided entry points for breaking encryptions. The work required thousands of hours of patient analysis, building card files that tracked every numerical group and hypothesized what Japanese words or phrases they might represent, testing hypotheses against new intercepts to see if proposed meanings produced intelligible text. Most attempts failed, produced nonsense that meant the hypothesis was wrong, and the analysts had to start over with different assumptions. But gradually, the percentage of messages that could be read increased from 5% to 10% to 40%, which was enough to provide actionable intelligence, even though the majority of message content remained obscure. The Japanese never fully realized how much of their communications were being read, never changed their code systems in ways that would have shut down American code breaking, never implemented the security procedures that might have prevented American cryptanalysts from building the understanding of JN25 that made reading operational messages possible. When Japan planned their final carrier operation in 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American fighters massacred Japanese air groups in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American intelligence provided Admiral Raymond Spruance with advance warning of Japanese intentions that allowed him to position his carrier task forces optimally and to prepare fighter defenses that destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The intelligence advantage that came from reading Japanese codes meant American commanders fought the Pacific War with knowledge of enemy capabilities and intentions the Japanese commanders couldn't match because Japan had never developed the code-breaking capabilities that Britain and America had built, had focused their intelligence efforts on tactical reconnaissance and battlefield intelligence, rather than on the strategic signals intelligence that revealed operational patterns and long-term intentions. After World War II ended, the full extent of Allied code-breaking operations remained classified for decades because the British and Americans wanted to preserve their capabilities for use during the Cold War, and because revealing how Enigma and JN25 had been broken would require explaining methods and technologies that had continuing intelligence value. The Enigma secret was partially revealed in the 1970s, when British historians began publishing accounts of Bletchley Park's operations, but the complete story took years to emerge, as participants who'd been sworn to secrecy finally spoke about their wartime work. Alan Turing's contributions weren't publicly acknowledged for decades, and he died in 1954 without receiving proper recognition for work that had been decisive in winning the war, but which remained classified and which he couldn't discuss even with people who praised his theoretical work on computation and artificial intelligence. Joseph Rochefort's role in the victory at Midway was minimized by Washington intelligence bureaucrats who resented his independence and who were embarrassed that a subordinate command had provided better intelligence than the centralized agencies they controlled. The women who'd worked as cryptanalysts and machine operators and translators remained largely invisible in histories that focused on male leaders, and that reflected the gender biases of societies that hadn't yet recognized women's contributions to winning wars, fought as much with intelligence as with firepower. The gradual revelation of what codebreakers had accomplished during World War II changed understanding of how the war had been won, demonstrated that intelligence operations had been as important as battlefield victories, showed that the popular narrative of wars being won by brave soldiers and brilliant generals was incomplete without acknowledging the mathematicians and linguists and clerks who'd worked in basements and mansions, breaking enemy codes and providing commanders with intelligence that made victories possible. The veterans who'd done this work often struggled to explain what they'd accomplished, because the work was so technical and so classified that even decades later they couldn't discuss details, and because the connection between their abstract analytical work and battlefield outcomes wasn't obvious to people who hadn't experienced how intelligence shaped operational planning and tactical execution. The legacy of World War II code-breaking operations shaped post-war intelligence services and influenced how nations approached signals intelligence throughout the Cold War and into the modern era. The National Security Agency, established in 1952, inherited the tradition of American cryptanalytic work that had been developed during World War II and applied those lessons to breaking Soviet codes and intercepting communist communications. The government communications headquarters, which succeeded Bletchley Park, continued British signals intelligence operations and maintained the close cooperation with American intelligence services that had been developed during the war. The technologies developed for breaking Enigma, particularly the bomb machines and Colossus computers, influenced post-war computer development and contributed to the emergence of the digital computing industry that would transform societies in ways that wartime codebreakers couldn't have anticipated. The experience of World War II demonstrated that wars could be won through intelligence advantages, that knowing enemy intentions and capabilities was worth more than superior numbers or better equipment, that the mathematics and linguistics and pattern recognition skills that seemed abstract and academic could be weaponized in ways that killed thousands and shaped history. The men and women who'd worked in these organizations understood that their contributions had been decisive, but often found it difficult to process the moral implications of work that had killed enemies through operational advantages that came from reading their private communications, that had sent submarines to ambush carriers and bombers to attack convoys because codebreakers had revealed where those targets would be. The work had been necessary, had shortened the war and saved Allied lives by giving commanders intelligence that let them avoid German strength and exploit Japanese vulnerabilities. But it had also created situations where people died because cryptanalysts in distant offices had broken codes that revealed where those people would be and when they'd be vulnerable. The story of how codebreakers won battles before troops landed is ultimately a story about how modern warfare expanded beyond physical battlefields to include struggles for information and intelligence that were as decisive as any combat operation. Joseph Rochefort, standing in his basement at Pearl Harbor analyzing Japanese radio intercepts, Alan Turing designing machines to break Enigma at Bletchley Park, the thousands of women operating bombs and processing decrypts and maintaining files that tracked enemy communications patterns. All of them were fighting the war as surely as soldiers landing on beaches or pilots attacking carriers, and their contributions were as important to Allied victory as any battlefield courage or tactical brilliance. The intelligence they produced gave Allied commanders advantages that multiplied the effectiveness of forces that were often outnumbered or outpositioned in early battles, that allowed defensive operations to succeed because defenders knew when and where attacks would come, that enabled offensive operations to exploit weaknesses because attackers understood enemy force dispositions and capabilities. At Midway, American carriers were able to ambush Japanese forces because codebreakers revealed Japanese intentions and allowed Admiral Nimitz to position his forces optimally. On D-Day, Allied troops landed on Normandy beaches that had been selected partly based on ultra-intelligence about German defensive preparations, and fought a campaign where Allied commanders consistently had better intelligence about German capabilities than German commanders had about Allied intentions. The mathematics of warfare that dictated that larger forces with more resources would eventually prevail over smaller forces with fewer resources was accelerated by intelligence advantages that came from breaking enemy codes, from reading communications that revealed plans and capabilities and weaknesses that could be exploited. The war would have been won by the Allies regardless, because American and Soviet industrial capacity was overwhelming compared to Axis resources. But the intelligence advantages provided by code-breaking shortened the war by months or years and saved hundreds of thousands of lives by preventing failed operations and enabling campaigns that succeeded with fewer casualties than would have been required. Without the intelligence that let commanders see through the fog of war that normally obscured enemy intentions and capabilities, the codebreakers won battles before troops landed by providing knowledge that made victory possible, by turning the enemy's communications against them, by demonstrating that in modern warfare, the struggle for information was as important as the struggle for territory or resources. When Hermann Kostler fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier Shokaku in June 1944, he was exploiting intelligence advantages that came from years of code-breaking work that had given American submarine forces knowledge of Japanese fleet movements. When Allied bombers attacked German positions in France during the Normandy campaign, they were often guided by ultra-intelligence that revealed where German forces were concentrated and where supply lines were vulnerable. Every major operation of World War II was shaped by intelligence that came from patient, cryptanalysis conducted by people who never saw battlefields, but whose work determined outcomes as surely as any soldier's courage or any commander's tactical genius, proving that wars are won not just by those who fight, but by those who understand what the enemy intends before the enemy acts.